The forest trail was supposed to be peaceful, a quiet retreat from the chaos of life. But there was one rule. Posted at the entrance, stay on the path. I didn't listen, and now, every shadow I see, every whisper in the dark reminds me of the mistake that followed me home. The trailhead was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. A large wooden sign stood at the entrance, weathered and split from years of exposure. Its message was simple but ominous: stay on the path. Below it, someone had scrawled in red paint, or else. I hesitated, staring at the sign longer than I wanted to admit. The forest beyond looked inviting, its dense canopy of trees casting cool shadows over the dirt trail. It felt like stepping into a postcard, but the warning clung to my thoughts. I shook my head, laughing at myself. It was probably some local legend to keep tourists in check. Still, as I stepped onto the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sign was more than just a suggestion. The forest was breathtaking at first. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden shafts, and the scent of pine filled the air. The main trail was well-trodden, wide enough for two people to walk side by side. But after about half an hour, I reached a fork. To the left, the path continued neat and clear. To the right, a smaller, overgrown trail veered off into the denser forest. A second sign was nailed to a tree at the fork, its message handwritten and uneven. Don't leave the path. It remembers. A chill ran down my spine. The words felt wrong, too personal. I glanced down the overgrown trail, curiosity pulling at me. It was darker, the trees bending in close, their branches forming a jagged tunnel. I took a step closer. The air felt colder here, the silence heavier. My heart thudded in my chest as I peered into the shadows. Something moved just a flicker, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I stepped back, shaking my head, and turned back to the main trail. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong choice. Somewhere behind me, a branch snapped. I didn't turn around. I quickened my pace, the snap of the branch still echoing in my mind. The forest around me felt darker. Now, though the sun hadn't moved, shadows stretched across the path, impossibly long, as if the trees themselves were reaching toward me. The air had changed. It felt heavier, colder, carrying a faint, metallic scent. I stopped to catch my breath, and noticed how still everything was. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the entire forest had been muted. Then I saw it. To my right, just off the path, something hung from a low branch. At first I thought it was litter, a piece of cloth or a discarded scarf. But as I stepped closer, my stomach twisted. It was a doll, old and weathered, its once white dress now brown with dirt. Its glass eyes were cracked, and its head tilted, unnaturally, as if watching me. I backed away, my pulse quickening. Just some kid's lost toy, I muttered, trying to calm myself. But as I turned to keep walking, I felt it a distinct pull, like invisible strings tugging at my arms, urging me to look back. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to ignore it, to move forward, but my body didn't listen. Slowly I turned. The doll was gone. A sharp chill ran through me, and my breath fogged in the air, despite the warm afternoon. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting between the shadows. But the forest was empty. That's when the whisper came. Faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. My name, drawn out in a slow, rasping voice. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. It echoed back at me, sounding small and desperate. The whisper came again, closer this time. My feet moved on their own, pushing me forward, faster down the path. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. But then the whisper stopped, replaced by a soft rustling ahead. My heart sank as I saw it, the same doll. Now sitting in the middle of the trail, its cracked eyes staring straight at me. I wasn't alone. Its cracked glass eyes seemed to follow me as I took a hesitant step back. The forest had grown, unnaturally quiet again, the silence almost vibrating with tension. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. A faint breeze brushed past me, rustling the leaves, but it carried something with it, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Why did you leave the path?" The voice wasn't loud, but it was close, like someone speaking directly into my ear. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was no one there. The beam of light danced across the trees, casting distorted shadows that twisted and stretched like living things. Then I heard its soft footsteps crunching on the path behind me. My chest tightened as I slowly turned. Gazed back. The doll was gone. In its place stood a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its presence radiated malice. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, its movements jerky, almost mechanical. The air around me grew colder, and the metallic scent returned, stronger this time, filling my nostrils and making a gag. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure stepped into the beam of light, and my stomach dropped. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, like a porcelain mask. But then it smiled. The grin was wide, impossibly so, stretching across the blank surface. My breath hitched as it whispered. Again, its voice low and distorted. "You shouldn't have left." It lunged toward me, its long arms reaching out. I screamed, turning and sprinting down the path. Forest blurred around me, branches clawing at my arms and legs. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, accompanied by that terrible whisper. "You can't escape." The path twisted, but I didn't slow down. I wasn't sure where I was running to, only that I couldn't stop. Not if I wanted to survive. The footsteps were relentless, pounding the path behind me in sync with my heartbeat. The whispering followed, a low, guttural chant I couldn't understand but felt deep in my chest. "Keep running," I muttered to myself, my voice trembling. "Just keep running." The trail twisted sharply, and I almost slipped on the damp moss. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and erratic, barely illuminating the way ahead. Shadows danced around me, each one morphing into twisted shapes that seemed to reach out, clawing at my legs. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, faster. It wasn't just one figure now, I could hear multiple pairs, all moving with the same unnatural rhythm. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but the fear kept me going. I glanced over my shoulder. Mistake. They were closer now, their elongated forms swaying unnaturally as they ran. Their featureless faces glowed faintly, each one smiling that grotesque, too wide grin. The nearest one tilted its head, almost playfully, before lunging forward with outstretched arms. I screamed, throwing myself to the side just as it swiped at me. My shoulder slammed into a tree, pain shooting down my arm, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and pushed forward, the path narrowing as the trees closed in around me. Then the trail ended. I skidded to a halt, my heart plummeting. In front of me was a steep drop, a jagged ravine cutting through the forest. The other side seemed impossibly far, shrouded in mist. The whispering stopped. I turned slowly, my legs trembling. They were there, standing at the edge of the path, their smiles stretching even wider. One stepped forward, its head tilting as it raised an impossibly long arm and pointed at me. "Stay," it rasped, the word echoing through the forest. "No," I whispered, stepping back until my heels touched the edge of the ravine. The figure lunged and I jumped. The air rushed around me, the forest vanishing into a blur. For a moment, there was silence, blissful, empty silence. Then the whispers returned, louder than ever, as the darkness swallowed me whole. I jolted awake, gasping for air. My body ached, my head throbbed, and the taste of damp earth lingered in my mouth. I was no longer in the forest. Somehow I was in my bed home, safe, or so it seemed. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. I reached for my phone, desperate for a sense of normalcy, but it wasn't where I left it. My bedside table was empty. A faint noise caught my attention, a soft scratching, like nails dragging against wood. My heart sank. It was coming from the closet. Just the house settling, I whispered to myself, though my voice was shaky. Nothing's there. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, waiting, hoping it wouldn't return. But instead of scratching, there came a voice. Low, guttural, and wrong. Why did you leave the path? The blood drained from my face. My body froze as the doorknob on the closet began to turn, the metal. Squealing in slow, deliberate movements. I scrambled out of bed, backing against the wall, my eyes locked on the closet door. It creaked open just an inch, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick and suffocating. A shadow spilled out from the opening, stretching across the floor like ink. It moved unnaturally, reaching toward me with jagged edges. Stay, the voice rasped, louder this time. I screamed, grabbing the lamp from the bedside table and throwing it toward the shadow. The bulb shattered, the light flaring briefly before plunging the room into deeper darkness. The shadow stopped, retreating slightly, but it didn't vanish. It lingered, coiled in the corner of the room, waiting. Since that night, it hasn't left. It follows me everywhere, in the corners of mirrors, in the flicker of lights, in the whispers I hear just before I fall asleep. The forest didn't just let me go. It sent something with me. And now, I can't tell if it's watching me, or if it's waiting for me to return. If you broke a rule and brought something home with you, how would you fight back? Or would you accept the haunting as punishment for your mistake? What if the rule you broke followed you forever? Could you live knowing it was always watching? Always waiting? The old church had been silent for decades, its broken steeple and shattered windows a monument to its abandonment. But when I heard its bells toll at midnight, deep and mournful, echoing through the empty streets, I couldn't stop myself from walking closer. I stayed to listen, but I should have run. The night was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making even your own breathing sound too loud. I was walking the familiar path home, passing St. Martin's Church, as I always did. Its steeple, jagged and broken, loomed against the sky like a splinter in the stars. And then, it happened. A single toll of the bell echoed through the air, low and mournful. It stopped me mid-step. The bell had been silent for years, decades even. After the fire, the entire town had avoided the church. Like a cursed relic. The bell tower was said to have collapsed entirely, the bell buried in the rubble. Another toll followed, deeper this time, vibrating in my chest. I turned toward the church, my feet rooted to the ground. The sound didn't seem to be coming from the steeple. It was closer. I scanned the windows, dark and shattered, the shadows inside shifting unnaturally. A faint glow flickered. Deep within the nave, pale and weak, like a dying candle. I should have kept walking. Every instinct told me to look away, to go home, to forget I had heard anything. But I couldn't. The bell tolled again, louder, sharper, cutting through the cold night like a blade. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me toward the crumbling gate of the churchyard. As I stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder here, the scent of ash and decay hanging heavy. The bell's rhythm slowed, each toll dragging out longer, as if warning me. I stood frozen, staring at the darkened entrance to the church. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding. Then, the glow inside flickered again, brighter this time, and I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A voice. Come closer. Edku. The bell tolled again, and the glow pulsed like a heartbeat, pulling me toward the open doors. I should have turned back, but I stayed. The glow inside the church pulsed again, faint and wavering, like a dying ember clinging to life. My feet, betraying all reason, moved closer. The air grew colder with each step, wrapping around me like icy tendrils. My breath fogged in the still night, and the metallic scent of soot and ash filled my nostrils. The church doors, broken and warped from years of neglect, creaked as I pushed them open. The sound echoed through the hollow nave, bouncing back at me in distorted fragments. Inside, the darkness was alive, shifting in unnatural patterns that made my stomach churn. The bell tolled again, louder now, reverberating through the decaying walls. But it wasn't coming from above. The sound was closer, emanating from somewhere deep within the church. "Come closer," the voice whispered again, clearer this time. It was soft yet commanding, weaving through the echoes like a thread of silk. I stepped forward, my boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. Broken pews lay scattered like forgotten bones, their jagged edges casting twisted shadows in the flickering glow. The light grew stronger as I approached the altar, revealing blackened walls streaked with the faint outlines of handprints. My chest tightened at the sight. Small handprints, burned into the stone as though left by unseen flames. The glow wasn't a candle. It was something else entirely. Hovering just above the altar was an orb of pale, otherworldly light, pulsing faintly with each toll of the bell. And then, I saw the shadows. They crawled along the edges of the room, their movements jerky and disjointed, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Their forms were barely human, their limbs stretched and twisted in impossible ways. One of them stepped forward, and my breath caught in my throat. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless void where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. But it tilted its head toward me, and somehow I knew it was watching. "You were called," it rasped, its voice a jagged whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't mean to come here," I stammered, my voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and predatory. "Once the bells ring, you must listen." The glow dimmed, and the shadows closed in. The air in the church seemed to thicken, pressing down on my chest like invisible hands. The shadows moved closer, circling me, their distorted shapes flickering in and out of the pale glow from the orb above. The altar. "You were warned," one of them hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. The figure with the smooth, featureless face stepped closer, its elongated limbs swaying unnaturally. My legs trembled, but I couldn't move. My body felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the oppressive presence that filled the room. "I didn't mean to come here," I whispered, my voice cracking. The faceless figure tilted its head, its featureless void of a face seeming to bore into me. "Intent is meaningless. You heard the call. Now you must listen." The shadows shifted, their forms melting into the floor and reappearing closer. Their jagged movements reminded me of broken puppets, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and with it came a sound I couldn't place, a deep, guttural groaning, as if the walls themselves were alive and suffering. One shadow reached out, its arm stretching unnaturally far. The tips of its fingers brushed against my chest, and a wave of icy pain shot through me. I staggered back, clutching my chest, but the coldness lingered, spreading like frost beneath my skin. "You do not belong here," another voice rasped, low and guttural. "Then let me go," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. The faceless figure leaned in, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "There is no leaving. The bells have marked you." The shadows closed in tighter, their forms pressing against me. I felt them pulling at me, their cold tendrils sinking into my skin, filling me with a sensation that was neither pain nor numbness but something far worse. The orb above the altar flared suddenly, bathing the church in blinding light. For a moment, the shadows recoiled, hissing like wounded animals. You have one chance, the faceless figure hissed. Hear the warning. Break the cycle. The light dimmed, and the bell tolled again, its mournful sound filling the space. And then the shadows surged forward. I woke up outside the church, sprawled on the cold ground, gasping for air. The night was quiet again, the bells silent, and the oppressive shadows nowhere in sight. My hands were trembling, and my chest felt heavy, as though the cold from the church had seeped deep into my bones. I stumbled to my feet, glancing back at the church. Its doors were shut tight, the windows dark and lifeless. For a fleeting moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a fevered hallucination brought on by exhaustion or fear. But then I saw it, my shadow. It was wrong. The moonlight cast it clearly on the ground, but instead of mirroring my form, it twitched and shifted, its arms bending at unnatural angles. The edges seemed to ripple, like smoke curling in the wind. I turned, slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. My breath hitched, and a faint whisper brushed past my ear. Marked. I ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop until I was home, slamming the door behind me. My apartment felt safe, the bright light of the living room banishing the lingering darkness of the church. I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. Then the lights flickered. I froze, staring at the bulb overhead as it buzzed and dimmed. The room felt colder, and the faint scent of soot filled the air again. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Another flicker. This time, the shadow was unmistakable. It stretched across the wall, long and jagged, moving even though I stood perfectly still. My heart pounded as the whisper came again, louder now, filling the room with its presence. Why did you listen? I stumbled back, knocking over a lamp, the crash reverberating through the silence. The shadow grew, larger, darker, and then it moved, flowing across the room like liquid, curling toward me. I screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a chair, and hurling it at the shadow. It passed through, harmlessly, the darkness swallowing the light as it surged forward. The last thing I heard before the lights went out completely was the sound of the bell, tolling softly from somewhere deep inside me. And I knew. It had followed me home. The bell rang again, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like a sound carried on the wind. I froze in the middle of my living room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shadows on the wall rippled, dark, veins spreading through them, and the room grew unnaturally cold. The toll grew louder. It wasn't coming from the church, it was inside the house. Why me? I whispered, my voice trembling as I backed away from the shifting shadows. The bell answered with another mournful toll, deeper this time, resonating in my chest. My shadow on the wall elongated, its arms stretching into grotesque, claw-like shapes. I watched in horror as it detached itself from me, slinking toward the center of the room. Then I saw them. Three figures began emerging from the shadow, their forms jagged and wrong. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were blank and featureless, save for their mouths. Each one bore an unnaturally wide grin, their teeth jagged and yellowed. The whispering began again, layering over itself in a discordant symphony. Time to listen. Time to pay. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and landing hard on the floor. One of the figures leaned down, its grin splitting even wider. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat as its shadowed hand reached toward me. Baturi. Please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. I don't understand. You answered the bell, the figure rasped. Its voice echoed with the sound of tolling bells, each word reverberating like a death knell. Now you must carry it. The bell rang again, louder than before, and the shadows surged toward me, their forms melting together into a swirling mass of darkness. I tried to crawl away, but the cold tendrils wrapped around my legs, pulling me toward the center of the room. The walls began to bleed shadows, the edges of the room disappearing into blackness. The air was heavy, suffocating, filled with the metallic scent of burning iron. The whispering grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that threatened to split my mind in two. The final toll echoed through the room, shaking the walls and rattling my bones. And then, silence. The shadows stopped. The figures vanished. But the bell didn't. It was inside me now, tolling softly, endlessly. And I knew there would be no escape. What would you do if the bells called for you? Would you listen, or would you run? Share your thoughts below. The bell rings, but no one else hears it. What would you do if something so surreal suddenly became personal? Could you trust yourself to walk away? The job seemed simple: answer calls, handle reservations, and make sure everything ran smoothly. But there was one unshakable rule: never check room 13. I didn't question it until the night I broke it, and what I found made me wish I'd never taken the job. The night started the same as every other. The hum of the fluorescent lights over the front desk filled the silence, and the keys to the rooms hung neatly on their hooks behind me. It was just another slow shift at the Crescent Pines Motel, the kind of place where guests came and went without so much as a word. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, the stillness oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards behind me made my skin crawl. The unease started the moment I walked in and found Mr. Whitaker waiting. His usual aloof demeanor was replaced by a stern seriousness I'd never seen before. Room 13, he said abruptly, his voice low and grave. Never check it. Never go near it. If anyone asks, it's unavailable. I blinked, unsure if he was joking, but his expression was unyielding. Why? You don't need to know, he replied curtly. Just follow the rule. I nodded reluctantly, but the warning stuck with me as the night dragged on. Around midnight, the phone rang. I answered it automatically. Front desk, I said, my voice steady despite my unease. There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. Then, a whisper. Room 13. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the receiver, my pulse racing. I checked the system. No one had checked into room 13. It was marked as out of service, just as Mr. Whitaker instructed. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I stayed at the desk. The cameras were my safety net, a way to prove to myself that everything was fine. I flipped through the feeds, my eyes landing on the hallway leading to room 13. It was empty. But then, the screen flickered. For a split second, I saw something, a shadow, too tall and thin to be human, lingering by the door. When the screen cleared, the hallway was empty again. The phone rang again. This time, the voice was sharper, more frantic. Don't let it out. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time I felt like I'd made a terrible mistake by taking this job. The phone's click reverberated in the silence, leaving me gripping the receiver like a lifeline. My breath came in shallow gasps, my gaze flicking to the camera feed showing room 13's hallway. It was empty. But the memory of that fleeting shadow lingered. Its unnatural shape burned into my mind. I told myself to stay put, to obey Mr. Whitaker's rule. But then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it at first, but as the seconds ticked by, it grew louder. A slow, sibilant hiss, like a breath escaping through clenched teeth. Help me. The words made my skin crawl. They came from the direction of room 13. Against my better judgment, I left the safety of the front desk, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Hallway stretched before me, its walls seeming to close in the farther I walked. The air felt wrong, thick, oppressive, like wading through water. As I approached room 13, the whispering grew clearer, the words overlapping in an incomprehensible chorus. The door stood slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of impenetrable darkness beyond. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. The whisper stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, the absence of sound making the hairs on my arms stand on end. Then, A faint knock came from the other side of the door, 3 deliberate, measured taps. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run. But I didn't move. The door creaked open, and a blast of frigid air hit me, carrying with it the stench of decay. The room. Beyond was pitch black, the flashlight beam swallowed by the void. Then, from the darkness, a single word. Stay. I staggered back, my foot catching on the carpet, sending me sprawling. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, and the whispers returned, louder and angrier this time, seeping through the cracks like smoke. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was back at the front desk. The phone rang again, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. This time, I didn't answer. I spent the rest of the night pacing behind the front desk, my thoughts spiraling. The whispers, the voice. From the phone, the freezing air, they were all impossible to explain. And yet they had happened. I tried to convince myself to wait for Mr. Whitaker, to let him deal with it. But curiosity gnawed at me, sharper and louder than any warning. The door to room 13 had been calling to me since the first day I started. Now, I couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, I grabbed the master key from the drawer. The hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel into darkness, each step toward room 13 heavier than the last. The shadows seemed to shift as I moved, crawling along the walls as though alive. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse, a dense, suffocating void that made my heart pound in my ears. I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, echoing like a gunshot. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My flashlight flickered as I stepped. Inside, the beam swallowed by the oppressive black. The smell hit me first, a putrid stench of rot and mildew that turned my stomach. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The door slammed shut behind me, and the light above flickered to life, bathing the room in a sickly, yellow glow. What I saw made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in claw marks, deep gouges that crisscrossed the surface like a deranged artist's canvas. Blood old and blackened stained the floor in thick, sticky patches. In the corner, a figure sat hunched, its back to me. Its limbs were impossibly long, its joints bending in wrong directions. It moved suddenly, a jerky, unnatural twitch, and I froze. "Why did you open the door?" it rasped, its voice layered, as though a dozen people spoke at once. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It turned slowly, its face hollow and eyeless, its mouth stretching into an inhuman grin. The light flickered again, and when it came back, the figure was inches from me. "Now you're mine," it whispered. The room plunged into darkness. The darkness swallowed me whole, so thick it felt like it pressed against my skin. My breath came in, shallow gasps as I fumbled for the flashlight, its cold metal slippery in my trembling hands. When the beam flickered on, it barely pierced the blackness, casting a weak circle of light that danced with every unsteady movement. The figure was gone. But the room had changed. The walls seemed closer now, pulsating as if alive. The claw marks were deeper, fresh blood dripping from the jagged grooves. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else, until I heard it, a faint scraping sound. It came from above. I tilted the flashlight upward, the beam trembling as it illuminated the ceiling. My stomach dropped. The figure was there, clinging to the ceiling like a grotesque spider. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, its head twisting to look at me with that eyeless face. It opened its mouth, and a guttural hiss escaped, the sound reverberating through the room. I stumbled back, tripping over something soft. Looking down, I saw what appeared to be a pile of clothing. But as the light passed over it, I realized it wasn't clothes, it was flesh. Torn, discarded, and soaked in blood. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the door. My hands clawed at the doorknob, yanking and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the door was fused to the wall, the frame warping under my touch. The scraping grew louder. I turned, the flashlight beam catching the figure as it dropped from the ceiling. It landed with a sickening thud, its limbs bending in impossible angles. "You let me out," it rasped, its voice like shattered glass. "Now we're together." It lurched forward, its movements jerky and deliberate. I screamed, swinging the flashlight, but it passed through the figure as though it was made of smoke. The walls began to close in, the pulsating intensifying. Shadows seeped from the corners of the room, crawling toward me like living tendrils. My mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The figure loomed over me, its hollow grin widening. "There's no leaving now," it whispered, its voice echoing around me. "You broke the rule." And then, the flashlight went out. The darkness pressed against me like a living thing, cold and suffocating. My mind screamed for escape, but my body refused to obey, paralyzed by the suffocating dread that filled the air. Somewhere in the void, the figure moved its scraping, shuffling steps echoing around me. "Let me show you," it rasped, the voice low and guttural, like something ancient and broken. "You open the door. Now you'll know." Suddenly, the room shifted. The walls rippled, the floor buckled beneath me, and I fell, plunging into a blackness so deep it felt endless. When I hit the ground, the impact knocked the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping. I was no longer in room 13. The space around me was vast, its walls lined with what looked like rows of mirrors. But as I staggered to my feet, I realized they weren't mirrors, they were windows. And behind each one, a different nightmare unfolded. NTE. One showed a man huddled in the corner of a room identical to the one I had just escaped. His face was twisted in silent agony, his mouth moving without sound as shadowy figures surrounded him. Another window revealed a woman running down an endless hallway, her screams muffled, her pursuer unseen. I stumbled forward, desperate to look away, but every window seemed to pull at me, each scene more horrifying than the last. "Do you see now?" the figure's voice whispered, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. I turned, and there it was standing at the edge of the room, its hollow grin stretched impossibly wide. Gestured toward one of the windows, its skeletal hand trembling. "Look closer," it hissed. Against every instinct, I approached the window it indicated. My knees buckled as I saw the reflection, staring back at me. It was me, but not. My face was pale, gaunt, and streaked with blood, my eyes hollow and lifeless. In the reflection, I sat in the same room, my hands clawing at the walls as I screamed, silently. "They. This is room 13, the figure said, its voice swelling, filling the air. Not a room, but a doorway. Prison. And now, it's yours." The walls around me began to close in, the windows dissolving into shadows that slithered toward me. My reflection twisted, its movements no longer mirroring mine. It reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and I felt it on my own chest, cold and unyielding. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was my reflection's hollow grin, mimicking the figures. And then I was inside the window, watching, waiting for the next person who would break the rule. You've been warned to never open the door, but what if the door opens itself? Would you dare to step inside and confront the truth, or run and live in fear of what's chasing you? If you heard whispers calling your name from the other side, could you ignore them? Or would your curiosity make you the next victim of room 13?